Hello, I'm Anna Forrest and I'm Cultural Heritage Curator for the National Trust based in the East of England. Last autumn, I wrote an article for Current Archaeology which described a number of exciting finds which have been retrieved from beneath the floors at Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk. Today, I'm going to talk further about these objects and what they reveal to us about Oxburgh and the family who've lived there since its construction in the 15th century, the Bedingfelds. The Bedingfelds are Catholics whose continued adherence to their faith after the Reformation resulted in stringent restrictions and fluctuating fortunes, which had a defining influence on the house and its contents. And this provides the lens through which we must view Oxburgh's history and material culture. I hope this talk will also highlight the value of underfloor archaeology as a discipline and its importance to understanding the phasing, use, and alteration of buildings. By considering the disposition of finds beneath floors and their association with structural, decorative, and documentary evidence, conclusions can be drawn about the development and use of spaces over time and aspects of social history, such as clothing and pastimes. But first, a little context about Oxburgh Hall and how this all came about. Sir Edmund Bedingfeld moved the family seat from Bedingfield in Suffolk to Oxburgh in Norfolk when he inherited the estate in 1476. On the 3rd of July 1482, Edward IV granted Edmund a royal licence to crenellate, giving us a possible date for the construction of the house. However, dendrochronology and structural analysis has revealed that at least one range of the building may have been adapted by the Bedingfelds from an earlier structure, perhaps built by Sir Edmund's great-uncle, Thomas Tuddenham, who owned the manor from 1434 to 1462. Sir Edmund's chosen building material was brick, and Oxburgh's gatehouse is a tour de force of late medieval brickwork. Towering over the adjacent ranges of the building, its scale and ornamentation were overt displays of wealth and status. This floor plan, dated 1774, is the earliest surviving record of the layout of early Oxburgh. The courtyard plan house had a magnificent great hall on its south side, lamentably pulled down in 1775, which was described by Blomfield and Parkin in their topographical history of Norfolk as one of the best old Gothic halls in England, 54 feet long and similar in style to Westminster Hall. During the 19th century, the house was subject to a comprehensive remodelling in the Gothic style by Catholic architect J.C. Buckler, with antiquarian interiors incorporating designs by Pugin, Crace, and Willamant. The house and grounds were acquired by the National Trust in 1952, and the Bedingfeld family still reside in part of the house. In 2016, without warning, a 19th century dormer window slipped off the roof and crashed into the courtyard below. The survey work which followed revealed that Oxburgh's roof, dormer windows and chimneys required significant structural repairs. The resultant £6 million Raise the Roof project began on site in 2019 and will run until the end of this year. It has given the National Trust an unmissable opportunity to get under the skin of this ancient building. And alongside the building works, a research programme has encompassed paint analysis by Hearst Conservation, wallpaper research by Dr. Philippa Mapes, building recording by Pre-Construct Archaeology and Dr. Adam Manouge, historic graffiti recording by Matthew Champion and volunteers, and underfloor archaeology. The results of this work will enable an interdisciplinary understanding of the architectural, decorative, and social histories of this ancient house. We had planned to train groups of volunteers to carefully sort through the debris beneath the attic floors in advance of structural repairs taking place. Drawing from knowledge of projects at Knowle in Kent and Nunnington Hall in Yorkshire, we felt there was a high chance of finding significant objects under the floors, given the age of the building. But just as we were planning to embark on this in spring 2020, the first COVID lockdown was imposed, so the volunteers were stood down and key archaeology staff were furloughed. Freelance archaeologist Matthew Champion was already working with us on a historic graffiti survey, and he agreed to take on the underfloor work on his own, searching in the debris beneath every lifted attic floorboard and within the eaves voids, retrieving any finds, recording them and packing them. The team from Messenger Conservation, who were doing the roof works, were trained in what to look out for, and they made two fantastic discoveries themselves. After the finds were retrieved, the remaining debris was hoovered into rubble sacks for future sifting, which we hope will be done by volunteers when circumstances allow. We had imagined finding newspaper fragments, nails, glass, cigarette packets, buckles, coins, and so on. And indeed, we did find all of these things, as well as a mid-20th century box of Terry's chocolates, with all of the chocolates missing, but the wrappers neatly hidden away. But we couldn't have predicted some of the other finds we made, which span the entire history of Oxburgh, or the total number of finds. We currently have 770 catalogue records, many of them comprising assemblages of multiple items. Nor could we have predicted the remarkable condition they would all be in. Rats became the heroes of the hour, as a nest yielded numerous fragments of Tudor and Elizabethan clothing textiles, and the nibbled remains of printed books from the end of the 16th century. I'm going to talk through some of the most significant finds, examining what they can tell us about the building and about the material culture of a recusant family. These will include a late 15th century illuminated manuscript page, fragments of music from the 1520s, a book of psalms from the 1560s, fragments of printed books from the 1590s, and clothing textiles from the late 16th to early 17th century. All of these key finds were concentrated in the northwest range, where the original roof had been replaced in the 17th century and attics created. The floorboards we encountered had either not been previously disturbed or had been lifted, but with little disruption to the layers beneath. Matt Champion described how the debris beneath these floors formed a wave pattern, with the peak of the wave aligning with the gaps in the floorboards and the trough occurring beneath the center of the boards. In places, the debris was so compacted that he was able to take a section through it. The debris was also absolutely bone dry, which meant that the objects that were retrieved, although dirty, were in a very good state of preservation, having been away from moisture and light. The lack of moisture can perhaps be explained by the fact that the debris was mainly lying on top of a layer of lime plaster, which seems to have drawn out any residual moisture from it. The first attic room that was investigated on the northwest side of the house is immediately adjacent to the gatehouse. Structural evidence shows that a staircase once rose in the east end of this space, leading to a way through into the gatehouse, mirroring the arrangement which survives on the east side of the gatehouse. The stair had been removed by 1774, as it's not shown on the plan I showed earlier, and the opening presumably was blocked at the same time. This room yielded a number of items which have allowed us to consider how it was used in the past. A group of handwritten documents, which had been cut up into distinctive symmetrical shapes, was found amongst lots of pins, needles, thread, and so on. So we thought that these document fragments might have been used as patterns for patchwork. Given that this room has a south-facing window, it was easy to imagine it being used as a good light-filled space for needlework and repairs. However, there were also lots of tiny dots of sealing wax, an intact seal, and the sort of twine historically used for securing bundles of documents, all of which hinted at the room being used for sorting or storing documents. So the cut-up letters could just simply be explained as remnants of discarded documents, although the peculiarly precise way they were cut up still presents a bit of a puzzle. Percussion caps and lead shot, also retrieved from beneath this floor, suggested a third use for the room as a space in which to clean guns. A find from this room and fragments from the adjacent room provide a window into the world of pre-Reformation Oxburgh and again tie in with the theory that these spaces were used for document storage. A fragile parchment page cut from a 15th century illuminated manuscript was retrieved from rubble in the eaves by one of the builders, who thankfully spotted the glimmer of gold leaf and bright blue of the illuminated initials. The text is distinct enough for us to identify it as part of the Latin Vulgate Psalm 39. The leaf has been examined in person by Professor Nicholas Pickwoad, Book and Library Conservator, and from photographs by Dr. James James Freeman, medieval manuscript specialist at Cambridge University Library, and Professor Michelle Brown, Professor Emerita of Medieval Manuscript Studies at the University of London. It's written on good quality calfskin, and the leaf has been cut from a bound volume which had side margins which were wider than the column of text, indicating an expensive book. The original dimensions of the leaf and the lack of rubrics within the text are suggested of this being a psalter rather than a book of hours. The script and the form of the illuminated initials suggest that its likely place of production was the South Netherlands or northern France, probably in the first half of the 15th century. The use of blue and gold for the minor initials rather than the more standard blue and red is an indicator that the manuscript was a reasonably expensive production and suggests that further illumination featured elsewhere in the book. The likely inclusion of illuminated major initials elsewhere in the book is also suggested by the elaboration of the letter H of Holocaustum into the shape of a little human head, shown here on the bottom right. It's tantalizing to think that this discovery is a remnant of a splendid manuscript. The Bedingfelds certainly have form when it comes to the ownership of beautiful manuscripts, as evidenced by Harley manuscript 3866 in the British Library, which dates to the last quarter of the 14th or first quarter of the 15th centuries, and was clearly owned by the Bedingfelds from at least 1438. Many questions remain about the manuscript leaf. Did it belong to Sir Edmund Bedingfeld, the builder of Oxburgh Hall? What happened to the rest of the book from which this leaf was cut, and why was it cut from it? Why was it amongst rubble in the eaves? Was it a casualty of time, a remnant of a book stored in this attic, or had it been deliberately hidden away, either as a consequence of the family's recusancy or for another reason? Two tiny fragments of handwritten pre-Reformation music were retrieved from the room next door. Here, later boards had been laid over 16th and 17th century ceilings, and the debris beneath had not been cleared when these new floors were laid. The fragments have been examined by Dr. David Skinner, Fellow and Director of Music at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, who was instantly struck by the similarity between the notation on these fragments and that of a surviving part book of around 1525 in the British Library, Harley manuscript 1709, which is the earliest written source of Thomas Tallis's music. Dr. Skinner is in little doubt that they were created by the same scribe. The presence of these fragments at Oxburgh raises the prospect that the Bedingfelds fostered music making on a fairly grand scale in the 16th century. And there is evidence in an inventory dating to 1585 of the presence of a range of musical instruments in the house. The history of music at Oxburgh and the Bedingfelds' links to this have not hitherto been researched, and the discovery of these fragments has opened the door to a potentially vibrant world. This world, of course, changed immeasurably within 15 years of the creation of this music, as Henry VIII broke with Rome and established himself as the head of the church in England, and the effects of the Reformation took hold. In 1559, Sir Henry Bedingfeld, who had been one of the first of Catholic Queen Mary's supporters to declare her queen, and had later been charged by her with the perilous task of keeping Princess Elizabeth under house arrest, refused to sign Elizabeth I's Act of Uniformity. This act outlawed Mass and made it compulsory to attend the parish church for the Anglican service. Henry's actions signalled a shift in the family's fortunes and the beginning of their being known as recusants, literally refusers. In this context, the discovery of tiny nibbled scraps from a Tudor printed book are particularly interesting. There was just sufficient text to identify them as being from the English translation of the King's Psalms, a text written in the first half of the 16th century by Bishop John Fisher, who was later executed by Henry VIII for upholding the Catholic doctrine of papal supremacy. Fisher's original text was reworked in English in 1544 by Catherine Parr, who politicised it so that the Psalms were used as propaganda in Henry VIII's war against the Scottish and French. Thrillingly, a couple of months after these tiny fragments had been retrieved, a small volume with a tooled and gilded calfskin cover containing the King's Psalms and two other texts was found by the builders within a void under a dormer window. As well as the King's Psalms, the volume contained the Litany and a text entitled The Queen's Prayers, which was Parr's reworking of a translation of Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, with subtle Protestant overtones. It's a volume for individual or private devotion, which could have been easily carried around and tucked in a sleeve. The intact title page for the Queen's Prayers shows that this volume was printed by Henry Wicks in London. Wicks had a license to print this book from 1566 and was the first person to print the three texts together in a single volume. I was fortunate to be contacted by Micheline White, Associate Professor in the College of Humanities at Carleton University, Canada, who has studied this text in detail. And she was able to offer insights into the significance of the volume's discovery at Oxburgh. She suggested that in many ways this volume was a perfect text for recusants like Henry Bedingfeld. The King's Psalms and the Queen's Prayers were essentially Catholic, but they'd been produced by an English Queen consort and issued by the King and were thus thoroughly orthodox. The Elizabethan and Jacobean regimes clearly had no problem with the volume either, and it was reprinted many times. The Bedingfelds could use this text with the understanding that it was part of their Catholic tradition, but without raising suspicions. And for this reason, we don't believe this book was deliberately concealed in the location in which it was found, tempting though it is to think so. Micheline also pointed out that the Oxburgh volume is the only known example to contain prayers in the event of plague in the place in which there would usually be prayers for the monarch, a substitution perhaps explained by the fact that 1569 was a particularly bad plague year. This coincidence wasn't lost on us when we were studying this book during the pandemic. Further tiny fragments of printed books from the 1590s were found. Some were extracts from discourses of war and single combat, translated out of the French by J. Eliot, printed by John Wolfe in London in 1591. And others are from the 1590 edition of Book 1 of the ancient, famous, and honourable history of Amadis de Gaul, a chivalric romance from the Iberian Peninsula, first written down in around 1420. I spoke to Dr. Helen Moore, Associate Professor of English at Corpus Christi, Oxford, about the Amadis de Gaul fragments, and she noted how interesting it is that they're from the English translation rather than the French, which is what would typically be found in the libraries of great houses. She also explained that there was a significant number of known or suspected Catholics amongst the readers of this romance, probably because it's set in Spain and is generically Catholic, retaining mention of the Mass, etc. Of course, we can't say with certainty when this book came to Oxburgh, but given the context in which it was found, in proximity to other late Tudor and Elizabethan items, on balance, it seems likely that it was purchased for Oxburgh soon after it was first printed and distributed. The evidence for these books raises questions about the possible presence of a 16th century bookroom, or at least a collection of books. The books date from a time when Oxburgh was being managed by Henry Jerningham of Cossey, a member of another of Norfolk's great Catholic families, on behalf of his stepson and ward, Henry Bedingfeld, who had inherited the estate at the age of 8. During Henry Bedingfeld's lifetime, the Bedingfelds would appear again and again in the recusant rolls, which from 1591 provided a record of the fines due from recusants across the country, providing a healthy source of income to the Crown. It's thought that Oxburgh's priest hole was constructed in around 1589, possibly by the master designer of such spaces, Nicholas Owen, utilising a void behind the King's Room guardrobe. The top of this structure was revealed during roof repairs last year, and evidence recorded by pre-construct archaeology and Adam Manouge showed that its construction necessitated the adaptation of the roof by the removal of the collars in this area, the roof having previously been dendrodated to 1551 to 1579. As well as revealing what the Tudor and Elizabethan Bedingfelds were reading and hearing, the finds have offered insights into what they were wearing. A rat's nest yielded over 100 fragments of silk, velvet, satin, leather, wool, and embroidered fabrics. These have been examined by Emma Slocum, National Trust Curator of Textiles, and Mariah Jordan, director of the National Trust Textile Conservation Studio, and they've said with confidence that they date from the second half of the 16th century to the 18th century, and many of them are high status. Their presence in a nest below a floor, away from many of the agents which would ordinarily decay textiles, means they're in an excellent state of preservation, albeit filthy. The fragments appear to be from textiles that were being repurposed. Collars, cuffs, seams, and hems were cut off and discarded and taken away by rats in due course, so that the main body of the textile could be reused. Their discovery again sheds light on the historic use of the attic room under which the nest was found. Highlights include a large piece of slashed back black silk shot through with yellow, possibly from a 16th century sleeve. A fragment of blackwork embroidery, a technique used in the 16th century for detachable collars and cuffs, but also occasionally for entire bodices. A two-tone basket weave clothing fabric with metallic thread, which looks to be late 16th century in date, and a finely woven piece from a collar or cuff. Comparative research will help us to date and understand the original form of these fragments, and portraiture will be an important tool, as seen here. Our piece of finely woven collar or cuff has very recently caught the idea of Helena Lermans, a researcher and weaver based in Portugal, who's engaged in analysing the patterned canvases that were used by artists in the 16th and 17th century and reweaving these textiles. The pattern of the weave on this collar or cuff is a very close match for the pattern painted by Titian on a tablecloth in his The Supper at Emmaus, which he painted in 1530. And you can see the tablecloth painted here compared with our fragment. It's also a very close match to the weave of the actual canvas on which he painted his work, The Vendramin Family, between 1543 and 1547. This raises the possibility of fairly precise dating for our fragment and of it being woven on the continent. Apparel listed in a 1585 inventory of Oxburgh includes references to garments in wool, leather, silk, satin, and velvet, and high-quality furnishing textiles are scattered throughout the room listings. The final artifact retrieved by Matt in September was a leather knife sheath dating to the late 16th or early 17th century, embellished with stamped and incised decoration, which includes a fleur-de-lis. It's thrilling to think that some of these things would have been worn by early Bedingfelds, and that without the rats, it's unlikely that any of them would have survived. Since I wrote about the finds for Current Archaeology last year, the National Trust archaeologist Angus Wainwright has been working in the gatehouse in the principal first floor chamber, known as the King's Room. We needed to lift the 19th century brick floor here in order to install a structural tie. So Angus has been excavating an area to enable these works, and he's been recording the evidence he's revealed. He's found clear evidence for two previous floors beneath the current one. An early wooden floor has been evidenced by grooves for joists running north-south and some fragmentary remains of these joists. And he's also found evidence of a brick floor of possibly early 19th century date. The excavation has revealed intriguing evidence which suggests that after the wooden floor was removed, this high-status space was used as a workshop by carpenters, as evidenced by lots of wood shavings and offcuts of wooden mouldings, which would appear to be 17th century in date. Our early hypothesis is that this evidence may relate to the period after the Civil War. During the Civil War, part of Oxburgh was burnt by parliamentarians and the whole house fell into disrepair. When the second baronet, Sir Henry Bedingfeld, succeeded in 1685, he remarked upon how he was forced to repair this house and on the fact that my house being burnt gave my wife small encouragement to live here. And he talks of supplying the house with furniture that was burnt and making the house habitable. The open, centrally located space provided by the disused King's Room was perhaps the perfect area in which to prepare materials for use in the repair works elsewhere in the adjacent ranges of the house. Finds retrieved by Angus include some fragments of early stained glass, some incorporating black letter, and another shard perhaps depicting a bird. and a 16th century jeton, which was found resting against some of the surviving timber from the early floor. So what next? In order to fully understand the finds, we need to carry out conservation work and research using other collections, documents, and comparative evidence from the period. Our priority is conservation work to the most vulnerable of the items, for which we've commissioned condition reports and treatment proposals, and we're currently pursuing potential sources of external funding. We hope to put some of the more robust items out on display as soon as circumstances allow. This year, we'll also spend some time scoping future avenues of research and opportunities for collaborating with others to interpret and contextualise what we've found. Oxburgh's potential as a source of evidence for recusant history and the material culture of recusant families is very exciting. So too is the possible link between the Bedingfeld family and the patronage of music. We're also very keen to explore what the textiles can tell us, not only about clothing and furnishing fabrics from the period, but the practice of reusing textiles. Given that only a small percentage of the attic floorboards were lifted, we can only imagine what further treasures remain to be discovered in the future. And the underfloor archaeology is just one component of our research programme, which has also yielded new discoveries related to the decorative history through wallpaper and paint research, and structural phasing through recording and analysis of this remarkable building. Please do keep an eye on Oxburgh's website and social media channels for updates and for information about visiting the property. And if you'd like to follow up anything I've spoken about or send me a question, please fill in the form on the Current Archaeology Live webpage. Thank you very much for listening.